The war across the stars had lasted longer than anyone could remember, and by the time humanity joined, the galaxy was already drenched in fire. The Galactic Union, made of hundreds of alien races, had been fighting the Vorkan Dominion, a cruel empire of apex predators who ruled through fear and blood. Every world they conquered turned silent. Every fleet they met was destroyed. Humanity entered this chaos late, and when they did, no one took them seriously. Compared to the massive armored warriors and telepathic tacticians of other species, humans looked fragile. Thin skin, no claws, no armor. The other races mocked them, calling them soft-worlders who would never survive in real war. Among these doubters was a powerful Vorkan defector named Rakkar, who had once led raids against human colonies before turning against his empire. As punishment, the Union forced him to serve under a new officer as part of an experimental command program. That officer was Lieutenant Mara Hale, a young human woman with bright eyes, a sharp mind, and the unshakable will to prove herself. When Mara first walked onto the deck of the Union battleship ISS Valiant, all eyes turned to her and not in respect. The crew whispered, some laughed openly. The alien captains around her towered over her, some covered in scales, some with armored hides or thick fur. She wore only the standard human combat suit, nothing special about it, nothing impressive. To them she was a joke, but she didn't flinch. She saluted the commanding officer and took her place with quiet confidence. When she met Rakkar for the first time, the air seemed to tremble. He was twice her height, his black armor carved with the marks of countless battles, his glowing amber eyes staring down at her like a predator studying prey. His voice was deep and sharp when he said, "You? You are my commander? You can't even reach my shoulder." The room filled with low laughter, but Mara didn't back down. Instead, she looked straight at him and said calmly, "Good, that means I can aim higher." Her words silenced the room, and for a moment, even Rakkar blinked in surprise, though the others continued to doubt her. Mara didn't let their laughter break her focus. She threw herself into her duties with relentless energy. She studied every battle record, every ship system, and every weakness the Vorkan had ever shown. When others slept, she was still awake, running simulations or drilling her crew. Some of them began to notice how sharp her strategies were, how she always seemed to think 2 steps ahead. Rakkar, however, remained distant, watching her with the cold eyes of a predator waiting for her to fail. Yet something about her discipline and quiet determination unsettled him. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid of anything. Mara's chance to prove herself came sooner than expected. The Valiant received emergency orders from the Union Command. A major fortress world named Sarn Prime was under attack, and the Vorkan had broken through the defenses. Every second mattered. The senior officers hesitated, worried about sending an untested human lieutenant into such chaos. But Mara stepped forward before they could speak. "We'll respond," she said firmly. "Prepare for launch." The confidence in her voice carried weight, and for the first time her crew followed her without argument. Even Rakkar, silent and grim, joined her on the bridge. As the ship roared to life and jumped into hyperspace, Mara stood before the viewing screen, her reflection faint against the stars. She knew the laughter still echoed behind her, but she didn't care. She wasn't there to earn their approval. She was there to win. Deep inside, she felt the fire of something that no other race in the galaxy understood: human determination. It wasn't strength of body or sharpness of claw that made her dangerous. It was the refusal to give up, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. And though no one yet realized it, this human recruit, the one they laughed at, was about to change the course of the entire war. When the ISS Valiant came out of hyperspace above Sarn Prime, the sight before them was like something from a nightmare. The planet was burning. Flames rose through the clouds, and the dark shape of the Vorkan fleet hung over the world like a swarm of vultures. Giant warships fired plasma beams into the surface, tearing cities apart, while the shattered remains of the Union defense fleet drifted silently in the black void. The comm channels were filled with screams and static. Officers shouted, engines roared, and chaos filled every corner of the battle zone. The Union commanders, already overwhelmed, were shouting confused orders that no one could follow. Panic had taken hold of even the bravest soldiers. But on the bridge of the Valiant, Lieutenant Mara Hale stood still, her eyes scanning the battlefield map glowing in front of her. Where others saw destruction, she saw a pattern, a weakness. Bring us in close to the planet's magnetic field, she ordered calmly. Use the interference to hide our approach. Her crew looked at her in shock. To fly that close meant risking the ship's shields and engines. One wrong move could send them crashing into the atmosphere. Yet her voice carried a certainty that silenced every objection. Rakkar watched her closely. He expected her to freeze like most first-time commanders, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned forward over the controls, giving orders with precision. Divert auxiliary power to the railguns. Lock onto the enemy carrier's command core. They won't expect an attack from this angle. Her hands moved quickly across the console, setting up firing sequences while plasma fire streaked around them. The Valiant dived through the chaos, slipping between wrecks of burning ships and drifting debris. The ship shook violently as a Vorkon missile exploded nearby, but Mara didn't flinch. She gritted her teeth and shouted, "Now! Fire everything!" The ship's guns thundered, unleashing a storm of railgun rounds and missiles straight into the heart of the enemy fleet. The Vorkon flagship, a monstrous carrier twice their size, took the full hit. Its shields flared, then failed, and a moment later, a chain of explosions ripped through its hull. The entire carrier went up in a blinding flash, a sunburst of flame and metal tearing the darkness apart. The entire bridge fell silent. For a heartbeat, no one could believe what had just happened. The crew that had once laughed at the human now stared at her with awe. Mara took a deep breath, her voice steady as she said, "All ships, regroup. Focus fire on their flanks. Don't let them recover." Her calm tone brought order back to the fleet. The Union forces, inspired by her daring move, rallied together and pushed forward. Ship by ship, they began to turn the tide. Even the alien admirals who had doubted her followed her lead. Rakkar moved to stand beside her, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You are reckless," he said, almost growling. "That attack could have killed us all." Mara turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but it didn't. And we just saved a world." Rakkar said nothing, but his gaze lingered on her longer than before. There was no mockery in his eyes now, only something that looked almost like respect. Hours later, when the battle finally ended, the smoke of victory drifted across the stars. Sarn Prime was scarred, but it was still alive. The Valiant had taken heavy damage, its hull scorched and engines failing, yet it remained standing. As the crew worked to repair the ship, Mara stood at the viewing window, watching the quiet planet below. She knew this was only the beginning. The Vorkon would not forget what happened here. They would come back stronger, angrier, and more determined. But she also knew something had changed. Humanity, once mocked and doubted, had shown what it could do. They were no longer the weak recruits others laughed at. They were fighters, thinkers, and survivors. And as the stars flickered in the distance, Mara felt a strange certainty rise inside her. This battle would not be her last. It was the first step toward something far greater, a war that would prove humanity's place among the stars. After the Battle of Sarn Prime, the ISS Valiant drifted quietly among the wreckage of destroyed ships, its hull scarred and engines weak. The crew was tired but alive, and the stories of their victory had already begun spreading across the fleet. Many who once doubted Mara Hale now looked at her with new eyes. She had led them through certain death and won. Yet Mara herself felt no pride, only focus. She knew that this victory was not the end, only a pause before the next storm. In the dim light of the mess hall, where tired soldiers gathered to eat in silence, she sat alone, studying tactical reports on a flickering tablet. That was when Rakkar approached her. His heavy steps echoed through the room, and the conversations fell quiet as he stood beside her table. His shadow covered her, his armored frame towering over her as always. "You fight like a predator," he said at last, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "But not like my kind. You hunt differently." Mara didn't look up. She took a sip of her cold coffee and replied, "Predators chase their prey until it dies. Humans study the prey, learn its habits, wait for the right moment, and then strike where it hurts most." Rakkar tilted his head, his sharp teeth glinting faintly. "You think that makes you stronger?" he asked. "No," she said softly, "but it makes us harder to kill." From that moment, something changed between them. Rakkar began to observe her more closely, no longer out of contempt but curiosity. He had spent his life as a hunter, leading raids, fighting hand-to-hand in blood-soaked battles, believing strength alone ruled the universe. But Mara had shown him something new, a kind of power that came from patience, planning, and courage. Over the following days, when the Valiant stopped for repairs at a Union outpost, Rakkar sought her out again, this time not to challenge but to teach. "If you are to command warriors, you must understand how they think," he told her, leading her to the ship's training bay. There, he taught her the ways of the Vorkon, how to read movement, how to sense fear through silence, and how to fight without hesitation. He moved like a storm, fast, brutal, unstoppable, and every time she fell, she got back up. Her arms bruised, her breath heavy, but her eyes never wavered. After every lesson, she thanked him simply and returned the next day, stronger than before. In return, Mara began to teach him the ways of human warfare. She showed him battle logs, strategies, and holograms of past wars. She explained the idea of sacrifice, something the Vorkon never understood. "Sometimes," she said, "the strongest move is to risk everything so others can live." Rakkar frowned, not used to such thinking. To him, survival was victory. Yet as she spoke, he began to see the strange strength hidden behind human weakness. She wasn't trying to be the strongest warrior. She was trying to be the smartest one. Slowly, respect grew where hatred once stood. When they trained, their movements began to match, her quickness blending with his power, her strategy shaping his instinct. Together they became something neither species had ever seen, a perfect balance between intelligence and instinct, between human and predator. Late one night, as they stood together on the observation deck, looking out into the endless field of stars, Rakkar finally spoke what he had been thinking. "You are not like the others," he said quietly. "You do not command through fear. You command through will." Mara smiled faintly. "Fear breaks," she said. "Will doesn't." For the first time, Rakkar bowed his head slightly. "Perhaps," he said, "it is time the predators learn from the prey." Mara turned to him, her eyes sharp and bright in the starlight. "We're not prey," she said simply. "Not anymore." In that silent moment, an unspoken bond formed between them, a bond forged not from rank or orders, but from respect. And though neither of them knew it yet, this strange alliance between a human and a predator would change the fate of the galaxy forever. Months passed after the victory at Sarn Prime, and the war grew darker with every battle. The Vorkon Dominion was not slowing down. It was gathering strength like a storm ready to swallow everything. Planet after planet fell, and the Galactic Union, once full of pride, now stood on the edge of collapse. Fear spread faster than light across the stars. Many believed that the war was already lost. The humans, who had once been seen as newcomers, had become a symbol of hope. But even their courage could not fill the holes left by endless defeats. Lieutenant Mara Hale, now known as the hero of Sarn Prime, had been promoted, but the burden of leadership was heavy. Her ship, the ISS Valiant, had been repaired, though its scars still marked the hull, a reminder of what they had survived. The crew had changed, too. They no longer doubted her. They followed her without question. Even Rakkar, once her greatest skeptic, now stood beside her as her second in command. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried the weight of experience. Together, they had fought in several skirmishes, each one deadlier than the last. The Union's last hope lay at Delta Orion, a massive star system that served as a defensive line for the inner colonies. If Delta Orion fell, the Dominion would reach the heart of the galaxy, and nothing would stop them. The Union gathered its remaining fleets there, thousands of ships, millions of soldiers from every corner of known space. But when the Vorkon arrived, their numbers were beyond imagination. The sky itself seemed to darken under their ships. The first strike came without warning, and within minutes the outer defense lines were shattered. Union commanders panicked, shouting orders that made no sense, and ships began retreating in confusion. The battle quickly turned into chaos. On the Valiant's bridge, alarms blared as enemy fire streaked past. Officers shouted warnings, and the comms were filled with cries for help. Yet through it all, Mara stood still, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. She could see the disaster unfolding. The Vorkon were forcing the fleet into open space where their superior firepower would destroy them all. Rakkar turned to her, his voice grim. "They are breaking formation. We will be surrounded soon." Mara's gaze sharpened. "Not if we make them think we're running." He frowned. "Running?" She smiled faintly. "We'll retreat, but on our terms." She sent out new orders, her voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. All ships fall back into the asteroid belt. Make it look like a full retreat. Keep weapons cold and shields low. Let them chase us. The other captains hesitated, but Mara's reputation was strong enough that they obeyed. As expected, the Vorkon took the bait. Confident of victory, their fleet followed the retreating ships into the dense asteroid field. What they didn't know was that Mara had already turned the belt into a trap. Hidden mines, cloaked drones, and auto-turrets waited silently among the rocks, all ready to strike. When the enemy fleet entered the field, Mara gave the signal. "Now," she said softly. The stars exploded in fire. Dozens of mines detonated at once, ripping through the Vorkon formation. The drones sprang to life, firing from every direction. Enemy ships collided with asteroids as they tried to escape, their formation collapsing. The trap was perfect. The hunters had become the hunted. The Valiant led the counterattack, its weapons blazing as it tore through the chaos. The Union fleet re-emerged, rallying behind Mara's flag. The Vorkon, caught between the asteroids and the renewed assault, were crushed. It was the most devastating defeat their kind had suffered in decades. But victory came with a heavy price. The Valiant had taken severe damage during the battle, and several of its crew were dead. The ship's systems were failing, and fires burned through the corridors. In the middle of it all, Rakkar was gravely wounded after saving Mara from a collapsing support beam. As medics carried him to the infirmary, he reached out a clawed hand and gripped hers tightly. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. "You lead better than any predator I have ever known." Mara knelt beside him, her voice quiet but steady. "And you fight better than any human." For a moment the sounds of battle faded, and all that remained was respect between warrior and commander, predator and prey. When the flames finally dimmed and the silence returned to space, Mara stood once more on the bridge, staring at the stars. She knew the war was far from over. The Vorkon would come again, stronger and angrier. But she also knew that humanity had proven itself beyond doubt. They were no longer the weak newcomers the galaxy once laughed at. They were leaders now, and under her command, they would not fall. The victory at Delta Orion spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Every world that still stood under the Union's banner heard the same story. The human commander who had outsmarted the Vorkon and turned their own strength against them. For the first time in years, hope returned to those who had almost given up. But hope was fragile, and it did not last long. The Vorkon Dominion, humiliated and furious, gathered all its forces for one final strike. At their head was Overlord Krithar, the supreme warlord of the Dominion, a creature of terrifying size and power who had never known defeat. His armies were vast, his ships countless, and his wrath unstoppable. The Union, already broken and divided by years of war, began to fracture further. Some species called for surrender, others blamed humanity for provoking the enemy, and a few even fled to the outer colonies, abandoning the fight altogether. The once mighty alliance now hung by a single thread. Amid this growing chaos, one name still united them: Mara Hale, aboard the ISS Valiant. Now repaired after months of struggle, Mara stood before her officers and allies, knowing that this would be the greatest test of her life. The message from the Union Council was simple. Krithar's armada was approaching the Orion Gate, the last defense before the core worlds. If it fell, the Dominion would conquer everything. There would be no second chance. In the war room, surrounded by alien generals and commanders, Mara listened as they argued among themselves, each one desperate, fearful, and unwilling to take responsibility. Finally, she raised her voice, calm but commanding. "Enough, we don't have time for fear." The room fell silent. Her eyes burned with determination as she continued. "They laughed at us once. They said humans were weak. But weakness is a choice, and we didn't choose it. We learned, we fought, we survived. And today, we lead." Her words cut through the doubt like a blade. One by one, the alien leaders lowered their heads in shame, and then lifted them again in resolve. They would follow her. For the first time in decades, the Union fleet had a single leader who could inspire them all. When the day of battle came, the stars were filled with the fire of engines and the roar of weapons. The Vorkon fleet poured through the Orion Gate like a tidal wave, black ships blotting out the light. The Union met them head-on, 1,000 ships against 10,000, fighting with everything they had. Mara stood on the bridge of the Valiant, her hands steady on the console, her voice calm as she directed the fleet. "Keep formation. Focus fire on their command ships. Trust your wingmen. We win together or we die together. Rakhar, scarred but unbroken, stood at her side once more. His deep voice rumbled through the command deck. Krithar is here. I can feel him. Mara nodded. Then that's where we go. Without hesitation, she ordered the Valiant to charge straight toward the heart of the enemy fleet. The battle was chaos. Plasma fire streaked through the void, missiles exploded like stars, and ships were torn apart one after another. The Valiant shook violently as it forced its way through the enemy lines, its shields breaking, its hull burning. Yet Mara never wavered. Every command she gave carried precision and purpose. Her crew followed her without fear. Even when enemy ships surrounded them, she found a way through, using debris as cover, turning enemy weapons against each other. Rakhar fought beside her, his instincts and strength complementing her strategy perfectly. Together they were unstoppable. The enemy called her the Ghost Commander because she appeared where no ship should have survived. As the battle reached its peak, Mara spotted Krithar's massive dreadnought, an ancient warship the size of a city, armed with enough firepower to destroy a planet. "That's our target," she said firmly. Rakhar looked at her, understanding what she intended. "It will mean death," he said quietly. "Maybe," she replied. "But if we don't end this, death will come for everyone else." The Valiant's engines roared as it charged forward, dodging fire and breaking through the last line of defense. The crew braced for impact, and Mara stood tall, eyes locked on the enemy ship. Around them, the Union fleet fought harder, inspired by their courage. Even as their ships burned, they refused to retreat. When the Valiant struck the enemy's command zone, a blinding explosion lit up the darkness. The blast tore open the enemy's formation and sent shockwaves through the entire battlefield. Krithar's fleet began to falter, their unity shattered. The Union seized the moment and pressed forward, driving the Dominion back. The battle that had begun in despair was now burning with hope again. But deep within the wreckage, Mara and Rakhar knew that the fight was not yet over. The enemy's leader still lived, and the final confrontation awaited them aboard the dreadnought. As the fires of war raged across the stars, Mara prepared for the moment that would decide not just the fate of humanity, but the fate of the entire galaxy. The battle that would decide the fate of the galaxy began in a storm of fire and steel. The Union fleet and the Vorkon armada clashed across the void, their weapons painting the stars in burning light. The ISS Valiant, half destroyed but still fighting, pushed through the chaos with its engines blazing, leading the final charge straight toward the colossal dreadnought of Overlord Krithar. Every gun on the enemy ship turned toward them, but Mara Hale refused to slow down. The ship shook as plasma fire tore through its armor, alarms screamed across every deck, and fires raged through the corridors. Yet through the smoke and destruction, Mara stood firm on the bridge, her voice steady as she shouted orders. "Keep moving! Target their main reactor! This ends now." Her crew obeyed without hesitation, even as explosions ripped through the hull. They had seen her lead them through the impossible before, and they would follow her anywhere, even into death. Rakhar stood beside her, blood seeping through the cracks in his armor, his claws gripping the railing. His deep voice rumbled over the chaos. "If we fail, everything burns." Mara looked at him, her expression calm but fierce. "Then we don't fail." The Valiant slammed through the dreadnought's outer defenses, tearing a hole through its armor before crashing deep into its interior hangar. The ship came to rest amid fire and twisted metal, its lights flickering out one by one. The survivors, covered in dust and smoke, armed themselves and followed Mara through the burning wreckage. Every step forward meant fighting through waves of enemy soldiers, towering Vorkon warriors who fought with rage and fury. But humanity fought back with something stronger than fury. They fought with will. Blaster fire lit the dark halls. Steel clashed, and bodies fell on both sides. Rakhar led the charge, his roars shaking the corridors, while Mara moved with precision, her rifle steady, her aim never missing. Together they cut their way through the dreadnought like a blade through flesh, leaving a trail of fallen enemies behind them. At last they reached the command bridge. The doors slid open, and there stood Overlord Krithar, the monster who had burned 1,000 worlds. He was enormous, covered in thick black armor, his claws like blades, his glowing eyes filled with hate. "You are the human who dares to lead predators?" he growled, his voice echoing like thunder. "You are nothing but prey pretending to be a warrior." Mara stepped forward, lowering her weapon and meeting his gaze. No, she said quietly. I'm the one who hunts the hunter. Krithar roared and lunged at her, his claws striking with terrifying speed. She dodged, rolling aside as metal shattered where she had just stood. The fight that followed was brutal beyond words. Every move was a clash between strength and strategy, power and precision. Krithar's blows shook the floor, but Mara used every ounce of skill Rakkar had taught her, turning his strength against him, striking where his armor was weakest, refusing to give him a single chance to end her. Rakkar joined the fight, slamming into his former leader with a snarl. The two predators clashed, roaring and tearing at each other, while Mara fought to reach the ship's control console. Blood covered the floor. Sparks rained from the ceiling, and the dreadnought trembled as its systems failed. Rakkar fell, wounded but alive, his voice hoarse as he shouted, "End it!" Mara looked at the control screen and saw the ship's core pulsing dangerously. There was only one way to destroy Krithar and his fleet, to overload the core from within. She turned back toward the enemy, who was struggling to rise, his armor cracked, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think you've won?" he hissed. Mara raised her hand to the detonator. "No," she said softly, "but humanity will." She pressed the trigger. The explosion that followed was brighter than any sunrise. The dreadnought erupted, its massive body tearing apart from within, and the shockwave spread through space, ripping the Vorkon fleet to pieces. The Union ships barely escaped the blast, but when the light faded, the stars were quiet again. The war was over. Humanity had won, but at a cost they could never forget. The Valiant was gone, and with it, its brave commander. Weeks later, on Rakkar's homeworld, the survivors gathered to honor those who had fallen. In the center of the city stood a new statue, a small human figure standing tall beside a mighty predator, both facing the stars. Below it, carved in stone, were the words, "Strength is not born from power, but from courage." Across the galaxy, every species remembered the human who had once been mocked, the one they called weak. They remembered Lieutenant Mara Hale, the woman who commanded even a predator's respect and led an army to victory. Once they had laughed at her. Now they spoke her name with pride, and though her body was gone, her spirit lived on among the stars, proof that humanity was never prey. Humanity was the storm that could not be broken,